They say the earth remembers everything. It remembers the blood, the sweat, and the sheer audacity of those who refuse to be buried in it. 20 years ago, a smug John Deere dealership owner stood on a grieving daughter's porch, looked at her father's fresh grave and smirked. "Sell the farm, little girl," he told her, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're playing a man's game now." He wanted her land. He thought he had her entirely cornered. He was dead wrong. Today, you are going to hear the true, untold story of how one young woman turned the ultimate insult into a sprawling agricultural empire and eventually bought out the very man who tried to destroy her. The casseroles had barely gone cold in the farmhouse kitchen when the first vulture landed. It was mid-October, the absolute worst time of year for a farmer to die. The Iowa air was sharp and biting, thick with the scent of dried corn husks and diesel exhaust. Clara Hayes stood by the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the 400 acres of prime, black dirt farmland that had been in her family for 3 generations. Out in the machine shed, a massive John Deere 975 OSTS combine sat idle, its hopper empty. Her father, Robert Hayes, had suffered a massive, fatal coronary event right in the cab of his pickup truck just 3 days prior. He was 58 years old. Clara was 23. She had a freshly printed agribusiness degree from Iowa State University and a heart that felt like it had been run through a grain auger. She was an only child, and her mother had passed away a decade earlier. The farm, the debt, the unharvested crop, it was all hers now. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway pulled Clara from her grief. A pristine silver Lincoln Town car rolled to a stop next to her father's battered Ford F250. The driver's door opened and out stepped Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling was an institution in the Tri-County area. He owned Sterling Ag Equipment, the massive monopolistic John Deere dealership that controlled the parts and service market for 100 miles in any direction. Sterling was a large man in his late 50s, favoring expensive wool coats and a gold Rolex that flashed when he shook hands. He was also her father's biggest creditor. Clara wiped her hands on a dish towel, her jaw tightening. She stepped out onto the wraparound porch, the wooden floorboards creaking under her boots. "Clara," Richard said, removing his felt fedora and pasting on a look of practiced sympathy, "I cannot tell you how profoundly sorry I am. Your father was a good man, a staple of this community." "Thank you, Richard," Clara replied, keeping her voice entirely neutral. She didn't invite him inside. Richard cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward the unharvested fields of yellow dent corn swaying in the cold wind. "It's a terrible tragedy. And terrible timing. The frost is coming, Clara. And Robert and I had some business pending. I know this is a difficult time, but the world doesn't stop turning, does it?" Clara crossed her arms over her flannel shirt. "If you're talking about the equipment note on the combine, and the 28410 tractors, I have the ledger. I know the payments are current through November." A patronizing smile crept onto Richard's face. He climbed the porch steps, physically towering over her. "Payments, yes, but there's a death clause in the financing agreement, sweetheart. In the event of the primary operator's passing, the principal becomes callable within 30 days unless a suitable, experienced operator assumes the debt. And frankly, Clara, the bank and I are looking at the situation. You're a young woman. You have no husband. You have no hired hands right now. That crop out there is rotting while you mourn." "I am operating the farm," Clara said, her voice dropping an octave. "I practically ran the planter myself this spring, while Dad was recovering from his knee surgery. I can bring the harvest in." Richard chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that made Clara's stomach turn. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded business card, tapping it against the wooden porch railing. "Listen to me, Clara. Farming is brutal. It broke your father's heart, quite literally. You have nearly $400,000 in equipment debt and a mortgage on this land that would choke a horse. I am willing to do you a massive favor. I have a buyer. The Osterhaus family over in the next county is looking to expand. They'll buy the land, and I will personally forgive the equipment debt in exchange for the titles to the machinery. You can walk away clean, go back to Des Moines, get a nice, air-conditioned job." Clara stared at him. She knew the Osterhaus family. They were closely tied to Sterling's dealership, often getting sweetheart deals on trade-ins. Sterling wasn't doing her a favor. He was acting as a broker to steal 400 acres of premium black soil for a fraction of its worth, likely pocketing a massive kickback. "The farm is not for sale," Clara said firmly. Richard's patronizing smile instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard line. The polite neighbor facade dropped, revealing the ruthless businessman underneath. He leaned in, his cologne smelling sharply of musk and peppermint. "Don't be stupid," Richard hissed, his voice dropping. "You can't run this place. The moment something breaks out there in the field, and it will break, you won't know what to do. You don't have the credit to float a bad season. Sell the farm, little girl. You're playing a man's game now, and you're going to get crushed." Clara looked him dead in the eye. She didn't flinch. "Get off my porch, Richard, and don't come back without a warrant or a foreclosure notice, because until then, this is my land." Richard put his fedora back on, his eyes flashing with raw, unadulterated malice. "You have 30 days to pay the note in full, Clara. I'll see you at the auction." As the silver Lincoln sped away, kicking up a cloud of gravel dust, Clara felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She had just declared war on the most powerful man in the county, and looking out at the endless rows of unharvested corn, she knew she had absolutely no idea how she was going to survive the week, let alone the month. The first 3 days of harvest were a trial by fire. Clara lived in the cab of the massive green combine, sleeping only 3 hours a night. The radio played crackling weather reports predicting an early, heavy snowfall by the end of the week. If the snow buried the corn, the stalks would lodge, snapping under the weight, and the crop would be unharvestable. The bank would take the land. Sterling would win. She fired up the 975 OSTS before dawn on the 4th day. The machine roared to life, but Clara immediately noticed a sluggishness in the hydraulic steering. She checked the fluid levels. They were fine. She dismissed it as the morning cold and pushed the throttle forward, engaging the massive separator. By noon, disaster struck. Clara was halfway through a quarter section when a horrific, grinding screech echoed from the rear of the machine, followed by a violent shudder that shook her teeth. A loud bang sounded like a shotgun blast inside the metal chassis. She slammed the emergency stop, killing the engine. Silence descended over the field, save for the wind rustling the dry corn leaves. Clara climbed down the ladder, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crawled underneath the rear of the combine, shining her flashlight into the oily darkness. The main hydraulic pump for the hydrostatic drive had completely shattered. Shrapnel had sheared through a secondary return line, bleeding neon-green hydraulic fluid into the Iowa dirt. Panic threatened to choke her. Without the combine, the harvest stopped. Without the harvest, the farm was dead. She sprinted half a mile back to the farmhouse, dialed the service department at Sterling Ag Equipment, and asked for Tom, a mechanic her father had trusted for years. "Sterling Ag Parts and Service," a voice answered. It wasn't Tom. "This is Clara Hayes. I need a main hydrostatic pump and a high-pressure return line for a 975 OSTS. It's an emergency. I have maybe 3 days before the snow hits." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Hold on, Miss Hayes." 2 minutes later, Richard Sterling's voice came through the receiver. "Clara, having some equipment trouble?" Clara gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white. "I need the pump, Richard. I know you stock them. Dad saw 2 on the shelf last month." "Well, that's the thing about inventory," Richard said smoothly. "It moves. I'm afraid we are completely back-ordered on that specific pump. Might take, I don't know, 3 to 4 weeks to get one shipped in from the factory in Moline." "You're lying," Clara breathed. "You're freezing me out." "I have no idea what you're talking about," Richard replied, feigning innocence. "But I do know that since your father's estate is currently in probate, your line of credit with my parts department has been suspended. Cash only, Clara. If we even had the part. Have a good afternoon." The line went dead. Clara slammed the phone down. The sabotage had begun. Sterling was deliberately bottlenecking her parts supply to ensure her crop rotted in the field. She called 3 other dealerships in neighboring counties. Mysteriously, 2 of them were out of stock, and the third refused to do business with her, citing territory agreements with Sterling Ag. Desperation pushed her into action. She booted up her father's clunky desktop computer and scoured early internet agricultural forums. She found a lead, an independent, massive tractor salvage yard called Colfax Ag Parts, located across state lines in Illinois, nearly 4 hours away. She called them. They had a salvaged, rebuilt pump from a wrecked combine. "I'll be there in 4 hours. Don't sell it," Clara told the bewildered clerk. She grabbed a wad of emergency cash her father kept in a Folgers coffee can, hopped into the F250 and drove like a maniac through the fading daylight. She arrived at the salvage yard just as they were locking the chain-link gates. She practically threw the cash at the owner, grabbed the heavy, grease-covered iron pump, and drove the 4 hours back in the pitch black. It was 1 a.m. when Clara returned to the frozen, moonlit field. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees. She had to replace the shattered pump by herself in the dark with freezing fingers. She backed her pickup truck up to the combine, using the headlights to illuminate the undercarriage. For the next 5 hours, she battled the machine. She fought rusted bolts that refused to break loose. She soaked her hands in freezing hydraulic fluid, her knuckles bleeding from slipping wrenches. At one point, a heavy mounting bracket slipped, pinning her forearm against the steel chassis. Tears of frustration and physical pain streamed down her dirt-streaked face. "Sell the farm, little girl," Sterling's voice echoed in her head. The anger flared, hot and bright, pushing away the exhaustion. She wrenched her arm free, gritted her teeth, and picked up the wrench again. By 6:30 a.m., as the first grey light of dawn cracked over the horizon, the final bolt was tightened. Clara poured 5 gallons of fresh hydraulic fluid into the reservoir. She climbed into the cab, her clothes soaked in oil and sweat, her body trembling with fatigue. She turned the key. The huge diesel engine roared to life. She engaged the hydrostatic drive. The combine lurched forward, smooth and steady. She had done it. Clara spent the next 48 hours harvesting like a woman possessed. She beat the snowstorm by exactly 6 hours. When the first heavy, wet flakes began to fall, the last bushel of corn had been dumped into the grain dryer. But as she sat at the kitchen table, running the numbers on her calculator, the victory turned to ash in her mouth. The yield was mediocre. The local grain elevator was offering a dismal $2.10 per bushel for standard yellow dent corn. After subtracting the cost of fuel, the drying gas, the salvaged parts, and the property taxes, Clara realized she was short. She had enough to pay the interest on the equipment note, but not the principal that Sterling was aggressively calling due under the death clause. While searching through her father's locked desk drawer for an old insurance policy, Clara found a hidden, leather-bound ledger. It wasn't the farm's official accounting book. It was a private log her father had kept for the last 8 years. Clara began to read, and her blood ran cold. The ledger meticulously documented a horrifying financial reality. Richard Sterling wasn't just selling tractors. He was acting as a shadow financier, leveraging his relationship with the local bank. He would aggressively push farmers to buy machinery they didn't need, arranging the financing himself. The ledger showed hidden, variable interest rate hikes buried in the fine print of the equipment leases, hikes that only occurred after bad harvest years when the farmers were most vulnerable. Sterling was systematically engineering defaults. When a farmer couldn't pay, Sterling would seize the equipment, and his cronies at the bank would foreclose on the land, passing it off to corporate buyers or Sterling's friends, like the Osterhaus family. Her father hadn't just been struggling, he had been suffocated by a calculated predatory scheme. Clara closed the ledger. The sadness was gone. It was replaced by a cold, calculating rage. She realized that trying to beat Sterling at commodity farming was impossible. He controlled the dealership, the parts, and the local bank. To survive, she didn't just need a good harvest. She needed to change the rules of the entire game. Winter settled over Iowa like a heavy iron blanket. Clara had managed to stave off Richard Sterling temporarily by utilizing a legal loophole in the state's probate laws, tying up the equipment note in the courts for at least 6 months. Sterling was furious, leaving threatening voicemails and driving past the farm slowly in his Lincoln, but he was legally paralyzed. However, Clara knew it was only a stay of execution. Spring planting was a few months away. If she planted standard commodity corn and soybeans again, she would remain trapped in the cycle of low margins and high debt. She needed a crop that paid a premium, a massive premium. In early February, Clara drove 3 hours to Ames, Iowa, to attend an alternative agriculture symposium at her alma mater, Iowa State University. The conference center was filled with standard corporate seed reps, pushing the latest genetically modified pesticide-resistant varieties. Clara ignored them. She wandered into a sparsely attended side room where a rogue agronomist named Dr. Harrison Cole was presenting to an audience of about 6 people. Dr. Cole was a brilliant, eccentric researcher who had spent the last decade developing a proprietary non-GMO high-protein white corn. It was a heritage crossbreed designed specifically for artisanal milling and the booming high-end organic tortilla market on the West Coast. "The problem," Dr. Cole told the small room, adjusting his thick glasses, "is isolation. I have the seed. I have a buyer, a specialty mill in California willing to pay $6 a bushel, almost triple the commodity rate. But to maintain the genetic purity, I need a farmer willing to dedicate hundreds of contiguous acres to this seed alone, far away from standard yellow dent crops to prevent cross-pollination. The big farms won't touch it. They want volume, not specialty. Clara sat up straight. Her farm, bordered on three sides by dense woods and a wide river, offered perfect natural isolation from neighboring fields. After the presentation, Clara cornered Dr. Cole. She pitched him her farm, her isolation barriers, and her desperate need for a high-margin crop. Cole was hesitant. She was young, and her farm was in financial probate. But Clara's sheer intensity, her deep knowledge of soil mechanics, and her refusal to take no for an answer eventually wore him down. "It's a massive risk, Clara," Dr. Cole warned her, sliding a thick contract across a coffee shop table. "This seed is temperamental. It requires incredibly precise planting depths and specific nitrogen timing. If you fail, the mill pays nothing. You get zero." "I won't fail," Clara said, signing her name on the dotted line. She returned to Oilvine with enough proprietary white seed to plant all 400 acres. But word travels faster than a prairie fire in a small farming town. By April, as Clara was prepping her planter, Richard Sterling found out she wasn't buying seed from the local pioneer dealer. Sterling didn't know what she was planting, but he knew she was taking a massive risk, and he saw his opening. On a rainy Tuesday, Clara received a summons to the First County Bank. She sat in a mahogany-paneled office across from Arthur Pendleton, the bank president, and one of Sterling's closest associates. Richard Sterling was casually sitting in a leather armchair in the corner of the room, looking supremely confident. "Clara," Arthur Pendleton said, intertwining his fingers, "the bank has been reviewing your operating loan application for the spring. Given the instability of your father's estate and the highly unorthodox nature of this experimental crop you intend to plant, the board has decided it represents too much of a risk. We are denying your operating line of credit. Furthermore, we are calling in the mortgage on the land, as the farm is no longer considered a viable commercial enterprise." Sterling smiled, a slow, predatory grin. "I told you, Clara. It's a tough business, but the Osterhaus offer is still on the table. Walk away. Don't embarrass yourself." Clara didn't blink. She calmly reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She slid it across the desk to Pendleton. "What is this?" the banker asked, frowning. "That," Clara said, her voice ice-cold, "is a copy of my father's private ledger. It outlines 8 years of highly irregular, undisclosed variable interest hikes tied to equipment loans brokered by Sterling Ag and underwritten by this bank. It shows a pattern of predatory lending designed to force farm foreclosures, violating several federal banking regulations." Sterling's smug smile vanished instantly. He sat up, his face draining of color. Pendleton opened the folder, his eyes scanning the copied pages. His hands began to tremble slightly. "Now," Clara continued, leaning forward, "I have the original ledger in a safe deposit box in Des Moines. If you deny my operating loan, or if you attempt to call in the mortgage, I will walk that ledger directly to the regional director of the FDIC, the Iowa Attorney General, and the investigative journalism desk at the Des Moines Register. I will burn this bank to the ground, Arthur. And Richard, I will see you investigated for federal wire fraud." The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the rain beating against the large glass window. Pendleton swallowed hard, looking desperately at Sterling, who was staring at Clara as if she had just grown a second head. The little girl he had dismissed on the porch was currently holding them both by the throat. "I suppose the board could review the application again," Pendleton stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead, "given the mitigating factors." "You do that," Clara said, standing up and grabbing her bag. She looked down at Richard Sterling, who was fuming in his chair, his fists clenched tight. "I'm planting my crop, Richard, and you are going to stay off my land. If you so much as drive past my property line, I'll have the sheriff arrest you for trespassing." Clara walked out of the bank, the heavy oak doors shutting behind her. Her hands were shaking violently from adrenaline, but her mind was crystal clear. She had bought herself one season. She planted the heritage white corn the first week of May. The weather was perfect, but Clara knew that Richard Sterling was a wounded animal now, and wounded animals didn't retreat, they lashed out. As the green shoots broke the dark Iowa soil, Clara prepared for a war that was only just beginning. By late July, the Iowa heat was a suffocating physical weight, but Clara Hayes's fields were a masterclass in agricultural defiance. While the neighboring Osterhaus farm struggled with heat-stressed, yellowing commodity corn, Clara's 400 acres of proprietary heritage white corn stood 8 feet tall, deep green and thriving. She had followed Dr. Harrison Cole's strict agronomic protocols to the letter. She applied nitrogen at precisely the right growth stages, utilizing a risky but effective split application method that most local farmers deemed too labor-intensive. The risk was paying off. The ears were developing beautifully, packed with the high-protein, dense kernels the California artisan mill desperately needed. But as the corn grew, so did the paranoia. Clara slept with the farmhouse windows open, listening to the heavy summer night for the sound of unauthorized diesel engines. She knew Richard Sterling wasn't a man who simply accepted defeat. He was cornered. Arthur Pendleton at First County Bank was breathing down his neck, terrified of the federal exposure Clara's hidden ledger represented. Sterling needed her crop to fail before the harvest. The strike came on a moonless, windless Tuesday night in early August. Clara was jolted awake at 2 a.m. by the distinct, low-frequency rumble of a heavy tractor. It wasn't on the highway. It was crawling along the southern boundary of her property, a dirt maintenance road that separated her land from the Osterhaus acreage. She grabbed her father's heavy Maglite flashlight, pulled on her boots over her pajama pants, and sprinted to her F250. Throwing it into gear, she tore down the gravel driveway without turning on her headlights, navigating by memory and the faint starlight. As she neared the southern boundary, the smell hit her, a sharp, acrid chemical odor that burned the back of her throat. It was unmistakably dicamba, a powerful, volatile herbicide used to kill broadleaf weeds. While genetically modified soybeans and certain specialized corn varieties could withstand it, dicamba was absolute poison to non-GMO, heritage crops like Clara's. If it settled on her fields, the white corn would curl, blister, and die within 48 hours. Clara flicked on her high beams just in time to see a massive, high-clearance John Deere sprayer retreating rapidly onto the Osterhaus property, its massive booms folding inward like the wings of a giant metallic insect. The driver had been riding the property line, deliberately misting the potent herbicide directly into the microscopic air currents drifting over Clara's fields. She slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was too late to stop the application. She jumped out of the truck, shining her flashlight onto the first rows of her corn. The wet sheen of the chemical was visible on the broad leaves. Sterling had done it. He had used the Osterhaus family to poison her crop. But Clara Hayes was no longer the grieving, naive girl who had stood on the porch in October. When she signed the contract with Dr. Cole, the agronomist had warned her about the extreme vulnerability of the heritage seed to chemical drift. "The big boys won't like what you're doing," Cole had told her. "They'll try to burn you out." Clara hadn't just listened. She had engineered a defense. She hadn't planted the expensive, vulnerable heritage white seed at the edge of her property. Instead, she had spent an extra $5,000, borrowed against her father's life insurance policy, to plant a dense, 100-foot-wide perimeter of standard, heavily modified, dicamba-resistant yellow dent corn. It was a biological firewall. For the next 2 days, Clara watched with bated breath. The outer rows of her property absorbed the chemical hit. A few of the weeds withered and died, but the perimeter corn stood strong, acting as a massive vegetative filter. The proprietary white corn, safely cocooned in the center of the acreage, didn't show a single sign of chemical burn. Clara didn't just celebrate, she weaponized the attack. Before the chemical residue could be washed away by the rain, she hired an independent crop investigator from Des Moines. They walked the southern perimeter, taking dozens of sealed tissue samples from the leaves and soil. Clara overnighted the coolers to Midwest Laboratories in Omaha, Nebraska, a highly respected independent agricultural testing facility. When the lab results returned a week later, they definitively proved a concentrated, unauthorized presence of dicamba on her property. Clara drove straight to the county sheriff's office. She didn't file a lawsuit. Lawsuits took years. Instead, she filed a formal complaint of chemical trespass and agricultural vandalism against the Osterhaus farm, ensuring a thick paper trail. She then mailed a copy of the lab results and the police report to Arthur Pendleton at the bank, with a single handwritten sticky note attached. "Tell Richard to call off his dogs, or the ledger goes to the federal regulator tomorrow." The message was received loud and clear. For the rest of the summer, not a single piece of Sterling ag machinery came within a mile of Clara's property line. She had won the battle of the soil. Now, She just had to bring the harvest home. October arrived, painting the Iowa landscape in brilliant strokes of amber, gold, and brittle brown. Exactly 1 year to the day after Robert Hayes had passed away, Clara fired up the 975 OSTS combine. The replacement hydrostatic pump she had installed in the freezing dark 12 months prior whined a steady, reliable tune. Harvesting the heritage white corn was a revelation. Unlike the standard yellow dent, which was bred for volume and ethanol production, the white corn was dense, heavy, and startlingly beautiful. As the grain cascaded from the combine's auger into the grain cart, it looked like a river of polished ivory. The yield was exceptional. Dr. Cole's experimental agronomy, combined with Clara's obsessive soil management, produced an astonishing 160 bushels to the acre. She was looking at roughly 64,000 bushels of premium food-grade grain. But growing the crop was only half the war. Moving it was the other. Clara's contract with Sierra Artisan Mills in California stipulated that the grain had to be delivered to their railhead consolidation facility in Chicago by November 1st. From there, the mill would take possession and wire the funds. 2 weeks before the deadline, Clara called Hanson Freight, the local agricultural logistics company she had booked in August to haul the massive load to Chicago. "Clara, I'm sorry," Gary Hanson said over the phone, his voice tight with feigned regret. "We've had a massive scheduling conflict. 2 of my rigs blew their transmissions, and we're backed up with the soybean harvest. I have to cancel your contract under the force majeure clause. We can't move your grain." Clara closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Gary, we signed this contract months ago. You have a fleet of 40 trucks. You're telling me you can't spare 4 rigs for a week?" "My hands are tied, Clara," Gary muttered. "You know how it is. We prioritize our high-volume, long-term clients." He hung up before she could argue. Clara knew exactly what had happened. Hanson Freight leased all their trucks through a commercial division of Sterling Ag Equipment. Richard Sterling had pulled a lever, threatening Hanson's fleet maintenance contracts to choke off Clara's supply chain at the 1-yard line. Without transport, the pristine white corn would sit in her grain bins, unfulfilled. The contract with the California mill would void, and she would be bankrupt by Thanksgiving. Clara spent the next 48 hours locked in her father's office, a pot of black coffee permanently brewing. The local trucking syndicate was entirely compromised by Sterling's influence. If she wanted to move 60,000 bushels of grain out of Sterling's territory, she had to look outside the system entirely. She turned to online trucking load boards, forums where independent owner-operators searched for unbrokered freight. She posted her load, premium rate, clean grain, Alwine, IA, to Chicago railhead. Need 4 hoppers immediately. Cash on delivery. For 12 hours there was nothing. Then her cell phone rang. "You the lady with the white corn?" a gruff, gravelly voice asked. "I am," Clara said, sitting up straight. "Who is this?" "Name's Jim Peterson, out of Gary, Indiana. Me and 3 of my buddies run independent Peterbilts. We saw your posting. The rate's good, almost too good. What's the catch? Why isn't a local mega carrier hauling this?" Clara decided to tell him the absolute truth. "Because the local John Deere dealership owner is trying to run me into foreclosure, and he threatened the local freight company to drop my contract so my crop rots in the bins. I need men who own their own iron and don't take orders from local bullies." There was a long silence on the line. Then a low chuckle rumbled through the speaker. "Well, ma'am, if there's one thing an independent trucker hates more than DOT way stations, it's a corporate dealership monopoly telling folks what to do. We'll be at your farm on Tuesday morning. Have the augers ready?" On Tuesday, 4 gleaming, custom-painted Peterbilt semi-trucks rolled up Clara's gravel driveway, their chrome exhaust stacks shining in the autumn sun. Jim Peterson and his crew were seasoned professionals. Over the next 5 days, they ran back-to-back relays from Clara's farm to the Chicago railhead, bypassing the local agricultural establishment entirely. On November 2nd, Clara sat at her kitchen table, a laptop open in front of her. Dr. Harrison Cole had called an hour earlier, ecstatic. The grain had passed the mill's rigorous quality control testing with flying colors. The protein levels were the highest they had ever seen. Clara hit refresh on her online banking portal. The screen blinked. Where there had been a terrifyingly low balance, a new line item appeared. Incoming wire transfer. Sierra Artisan Mills. The amount was $384,000. Clara stared at the screen, tears blurring her vision. She had done it. She had beaten the weather. She had beaten the sabotage. And she had bypassed the monopoly. She was solvent. But Clara didn't just want to be solvent. She wanted to make a statement. The next morning, Clara drove into town. She didn't go to the First County Bank. She drove straight to the sprawling glass-fronted showroom of Sterling Ag Equipment. She parked her battered F250 right between two brand-new $500,000 combines, ignoring the glaring sales staff. She walked into the building, her boots clicking loudly on the polished tile floor. She bypassed the reception desk and pushed open the heavy oak door to Richard Sterling's private office. Sterling was sitting behind his mahogany desk, reviewing a stack of leases. He looked up, his face immediately darkening with anger. "Get out of my office, Clara. You're trespassing." Clara didn't say a word. She walked right up to his desk, reached into her leather jacket, and pulled out a cashier's check drawn from a major national bank, bypassing Pendleton entirely. She slapped it down on the center of Sterling's desk. Sterling frowned, leaning forward to look at the slip of paper. His eyes widened. It was a check made out to Sterling Ag Equipment for the exact amount of her father's outstanding equipment note. Principal, interest and late fees, down to the penny. "What is this?" Sterling demanded, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That is my father's debt. Paid in full," Clara said, her voice ringing with icy authority. "The 9750 combine and the 28410 tractors are officially mine, free and clear." Sterling stared at the check, the reality of his profound defeat sinking in. The little girl hadn't just survived, she had outmaneuvered his entire network of influence. "You think this makes you a player?" Sterling spat, trying to regain his composure, though a vein pulsed angrily in his temple. "You got lucky with one freak crop. You still don't have the capital to compete in the long run. I still run this county." Clara leaned over the desk, placing her hands flat on the polished wood, bringing her face inches from his. "You ran my father into an early grave, Richard," Clara said, her tone utterly devoid of fear. "You tried to steal my land. You tried to poison my soil, and you failed. I'm not just going to compete in the long run." She stood up straight, adjusting her jacket. "Enjoy the showroom, Richard, because in 20 years, I'm going to buy it out from under you, and I'll fire you myself." Clara turned on her heel and walked out of the office, leaving Richard Sterling sitting in stunned, humiliated silence. The battle for the farm was over. The war for the county had just begun. The cashier's check that Clara Hayes dropped on Richard Sterling's desk wasn't just a settlement of debt. It was the starting gun of a 5-year quiet and relentless expansion. By the time Clara turned 28, the original 400 acres of the Hayes farm had become the nucleus of a rapidly growing operation. Clara didn't attempt to buy land outright. Arthur Pendleton and the First County Bank still held a stranglehold on local mortgages, and they would have blocked her at every turn. Instead, Clara utilized a strategy that completely bypassed the traditional banking system, the cash rent lease. Across the county, a generation of older farmers was aging out of the business. Their children had moved to Chicago or Minneapolis, leaving behind men in their 70s who were physically unable to work the heavy iron, but who refused to sell their family heritage to corporate conglomerates. Clara approached them one by one. She sat at their worn kitchen tables, drank terrible percolated coffee, and offered them guaranteed multi-year cash leases paid up front before a single seed went into the ground. She promised meticulous soil conservation, utilizing her proven crop rotation and cover cropping techniques to actually improve their land value. They knew she had beaten Sterling, and in the tight-knit world of rural agriculture that earned her immense, unspoken respect. Within 5 years, Clara was farming over 3,000 acres of prime Iowa soil, a massive footprint that rivaled the Osterhaus family. She had upgraded her machinery fleet, paying cash for gently used, late-model combines and tractors sourced strictly from out-of-state dealers. She had essentially created a multi-million-dollar enterprise, entirely insulated from Richard Sterling's local monopoly. Sterling, meanwhile, was slowly bleeding. His dealership, Sterling Ag Equipment, relied on an ever-expanding cycle of local debt to survive, with Clara showing the independent farmers that it was possible to operate outside of Sterling's oppressive financing schemes. A quiet rebellion had taken root. Trade-in volumes dropped, parts sales dipped, and Sterling's iron grip on the county began to slip. Desperate to reassert control, Sterling resorted to the only weapon he had left, local politics. He was golfing buddies with Thomas Briggs, the chairman of the county zoning and environmental board. In early spring, just as Clara was preparing to plant her massive acreage, she received a cease and desist order from the county. The citation claimed that Clara's aggressive use of experimental cover crops on her leased land was altering the natural watershed, causing unauthorized agricultural runoff that threatened the local river system. It was a completely fabricated charge, backed by pseudoscience and rubber-stamped by Briggs, but it carried a devastating penalty, a complete injunction on planting until a full, multi-agency environmental review could be completed. The review would take 6 months. By then, The planting window would be closed, and Clara would default on 3,000 acres of cash leases. It would ruin her. Clara hired a high-priced environmental lawyer from Des Moines, but the legal wheels turned too slowly. She was 2 weeks away from missing the planting window, staring at the injunction papers on her desk, when a strange car pulled down her gravel driveway late one Thursday night. It wasn't a sheriff's cruiser or a county vehicle. It was a modest 5-year-old Honda Accord. Out stepped David Miller, a 26-year-old junior sales representative who worked directly under Richard Sterling at the dealership. Clara recognized him from town. He was sharp, ambitious, and noticeably out of place among Sterling's old boys club. Clara met him on the porch, a heavy iron wrench casually gripped in her right hand. "Can I help you, David?" David looked nervously over his shoulder, his breath pluming in the cool night air. He pulled a small silver USB flash drive from his jacket pocket and held it out. "I shouldn't be here," David said, his voice trembling slightly. "But what he's doing to you with Thomas Briggs, it's wrong, and frankly the ship is sinking anyway. I'm not going down with it." Clara didn't take the drive immediately. "What's on it?" "The truth," David replied, his eyes locked on hers. "Sterling is desperate, Clara. He's missing his corporate sales quotas with John Deere. If he misses them for 3 consecutive quarters, corporate revokes his exclusive territory rights. To hide how bad the sales are, he's been falsifying his floor plan financing." Clara's eyes narrowed. Floor plan financing was the massive line of credit dealerships used to buy inventory from the manufacturer. "Explain." "He's logging phantom inventory," David whispered, stepping closer to the porch. "He submits serial numbers to corporate and the bank for tractors and combines that don't actually exist on our lot. He uses the loan money from the phantom machines to pay the interest on the real machines that aren't selling. It's a massive Ponzi scheme, Clara, and Pendleton at the bank has been looking the other way because if Sterling goes under, the bank has millions in unsecured, fraudulent debt." Clara finally reached out and took the cold metal drive. This wasn't just a ledger of bad loans. This was federal bank fraud on a multi-million-dollar scale. "Why are you giving this to me?" Clara asked. "Because," David said, zipping up his jacket, "I know you're not just trying to survive anymore. You're going to take him out. And when you do, I want a job on the winning side." The contents of the flash drive were explosive. David Miller had provided complete access to Sterling Ag Equipment's internal inventory logs, cross-referenced with the fraudulent loan documents submitted to First County Bank. It showed over $4 million in missing assets. Clara didn't immediately go to the authorities. If she triggered an FBI raid, the federal government would seize the dealership, freeze the assets, and tie the property up in litigation for a decade. Clara didn't want the government to destroy Richard Sterling. She wanted to buy him out. She wanted the deed to his empire in her own name. To do that, she had to apply a financial squeeze so tight that Sterling would have no choice but to sell everything for pennies on the dollar before the federal auditors caught wind of the missing inventory. Clara's first move was to sever Sterling's remaining lifelines. She quietly organized a meeting in the back room of a local diner, inviting the 15 largest independent farmers in the Tri-County area. These were men who had suffered under Sterling's predatory interest rates for decades. Standing at the head of the table, Clara laid out a bold proposal. "We are forming the Irvine Independent Growers Cooperative. Starting today, not a single one of us buys a filter, a belt, a gallon of oil, or a piece of heavy machinery from Sterling Ag." "Where do we get our parts, Clara?" asked Henry Mitchell, a grizzled farmer who leased 1,000 acres to her. "Harvest is coming. If a combine goes down, we can't wait 3 days for shipping from out of state." Clara smiled. "You won't have to." Using the massive capital reserves she had built from her heritage corn contracts, Clara had quietly purchased a massive, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. She had partnered with Jim Peterson, the independent trucker from Indiana who had hauled her first crop. Jim's fleet was now dedicated entirely to running weekly freight lines from massive, independent wholesale parts distributors in Illinois directly to Clara's new warehouse. She had effectively created a shadow dealership, stocking all the high-wear John Deere parts at a 15% discount compared to Sterling's marked-up prices. The boycott was absolute and devastating. Over the next 3 months, the service bays at Sterling Ag Equipment sat empty. The parts counter collected dust. The multi-million-dollar combines sat on the showroom lot, depreciating in the sun. Sterling's cash flow evaporated instantly. With no real revenue coming in, he couldn't cover the massive interest payments on his floor plan financing, especially the loans for the phantom inventory. Panic set in. Sterling marched into First County Bank, demanding Arthur Pendleton extend him an emergency bridge loan to cover his quarterly obligations to John Deere Corporate. Clara was waiting for this exact moment. 30 minutes before Sterling's appointment with the banker, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to Arthur Pendleton's desk. Inside was a single, printed spreadsheet from David Miller's flash drive, highlighting the $4 million in phantom inventory, along with a note from Clara. "I know about the missing serial numbers, Arthur. If you sign one more loan for him, I will forward this to the FDIC and ensure you share a cell with him." When Sterling walked into Pendleton's office, expecting the usual rubber-stamped approval, he was met with a pale, terrified banker who outright refused to authorize a single dime. "You can't do this, Arthur," Sterling roared, slamming his fists on the mahogany desk. "I practically built this bank. If I default on my floor plan, corporate swoops in and I lose the franchise." "I'm sorry, Richard," Pendleton stammered, looking frantically at his office door. "The board, our risk assessment. My hands are tied. You have to find outside capital." But there was no outside capital. Sterling was a toxic asset. As the deadline for his quarterly payment approached, Sterling became a man possessed by desperation. He began liquidating his personal wealth. He quietly sold his lake house in the Ozarks. He put his silver Lincoln town car up for private sale. He even attempted to quietly auction off several hundred acres of prime farmland he had seized from defaulting farmers over the years. But every time a potential buyer showed interest in the land, Clara Hayes was there. She used her network of allied farmers to outbid Sterling's cronies, or she quietly informed corporate buyers about the pending environmental zoning issues she knew intimately because they were the very same fabricated charges Sterling had tried to use against her. The land sales stalled. The squeeze was perfect. The walls were closing in, and Richard Sterling, the man who had ruled the county with an iron fist for 30 years, was suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late August, with his corporate payment due in exactly 48 hours, Sterling sat alone in his darkened showroom office. His phone rang. It was an unrecognized number. He answered it, his voice rough and exhausted. "Sterling?" "Hello, Richard," Clara Hayes said. Her voice was calm, clear, and devoid of any emotion. "I hear you're having some liquidity issues. I think it's time we had a meeting. I have a proposal for you." The air inside Richard Sterling's office was stagnant, smelling of stale coffee and the distinct, sour odor of a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the blinds drawn tight against the August sun, looking like a deposed king waiting for the guillotine. When the heavy oak door swung open, Clara Hayes didn't just walk in, she arrived. She was 28 now, her face leaner, hardened by half a decade of relentless pressure and sun-baked harvests. She wore a tailored blazer over a simple white shirt and dark denim, a stark contrast to the grease-stained overalls she had worn the night she rebuilt her hydrostatic pump in the freezing dark. Behind her walked 2 men, David Miller, clutching a thick leather briefcase, and an older, distinguished man in a grey suit, Clara's corporate attorney from Des Moines, Robert Caldwell. Sterling's bloodshot eyes darted to David. The betrayal hit him instantly, physically knocking the wind out of him. "You little rat," Sterling hissed, his hands trembling on the desk. "I gave you a career, David. You gave me a front-row seat to federal wire fraud, Richard," David replied, stepping to the side so Clara could take the center of the room. "I just chose not to buy the ticket." Clara didn't sit down. She stood on the opposite side of the mahogany desk, forcing Sterling to look up at her. 48 hours, Richard," Clara said, her voice a calm, smooth baritone. "That's when John Deere Corporate expects the quarterly interest payment on your floor plan. That's when Arthur Pendleton at First County Bank is legally obligated to file an audit report regarding the $4 million in missing inventory collateral. If that deadline passes, the FBI seizes this building by Friday. Sterling swallowed hard. The fight had drained entirely out of his posture. "What do you want, Clara?" "I want the keys," Clara said simply. "To the kingdom, all of it." Attorney Caldwell stepped forward, unsnapping his briefcase and laying a thick, blue-backed legal document on the desk in front of Sterling. "This is an asset purchase agreement," Clara explained, her eyes locked on his. "My holding company is offering to purchase the physical real estate of Sterling Ag Equipment, the existing service center contracts, the parts inventory, and the exclusive territorial rights to the John Deere franchise. Sterling looked at the number printed on the first page. He physically recoiled. $3.8 million? That's an insult. The real estate alone is worth $2 million. The customer database, the goodwill, There is no goodwill left, Richard, Clara cut him off, her tone turning to ice. You burned it all, and the customer database is useless because I already control the purchasing power of the 15 largest independent growers in the Tri-County area through my cooperative. As for the valuation, $3.8 million is exactly the amount required to satisfy your fraudulent loans with First County Bank and pay off your corporate arrears. She leaned over the desk, invading his space, mirroring the exact posture he had taken on her porch 5 years earlier. You walk away with nothing, Clara told him. No equity, no retirement package, no golden parachute, but you also walk away without handcuffs. You walk away a free man. You don't spend the next 10 years in federal prison for defrauding a federally insured financial institution. Sterling stared at the paper. His hands shook violently as he reached up to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead. He looked desperately at the walls of his office, the plaques, the awards, the photographs of himself shaking hands with senators and corporate executives. It was his entire life's work, a legacy built on the broken backs of local farmers, evaporating in a single afternoon. If I sell to you, Sterling whispered, his voice cracking, corporate still has to approve the franchise transfer. They won't approve a 28-year-old girl with no dealership experience. That's why David is named as the general manager and operating partner on the corporate application, Clara countered smoothly. He has the sales record, and he knows the John Deere system inside and out. And John Deere Corporate won't care about my age once I show them the liquid capital reserves my heritage grain contracts have generated. They care about moving iron, Richard, and right now, you are a dead weight. The silence in the room stretched out, agonizing and absolute. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. You planned this, Sterling muttered, his eyes wide, finally grasping the terrifying scope of her revenge. From the moment you paid off that tractor note, you didn't just want to survive. I wanted to make sure you could never put another family through what you put mine through, Clara said. She unclipped a silver pen from her blazer pocket and placed it deliberately on top of the contract. Sign the paper, Richard, or I make the call to the FDIC right now. Sterling stared at the pen. For a moment, Clara thought his pride might actually override his instinct for self-preservation. But then, the arrogance finally broke. A quiet, pathetic sob escaped his throat. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling so badly the ink smeared, and signed away his empire. Clara took the document, handed it to her lawyer, and looked down at the ruined man behind the desk. Get your personal items out of the office by 5 o'clock, Clara commanded. The locks are being changed at 6. She turned and walked out of the office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. She didn't look back. 20 years is a long time in the world of agriculture. It is enough time for soil to be reborn, for technology to revolutionize the harvest, and for a new hierarchy to solidify in the Iowa heartland. By the time Clara Hayes turned 43, the Tri-County area was unrecognizable from the days of Richard Sterling's tyrannical reign. Hayes Ag and Iron was now the premier agricultural equipment dealership in the state, boasting 3 massive locations. But the true difference wasn't in the size of the buildings. It was in the philosophy of the business. Under Clara's ownership and David Miller's meticulous management, the dealership operated on a model of radical transparency. There were no hidden variable interest rates. There were no predatory lending schemes designed to force foreclosures. Clara established an in-house agronomy division that actively helped farmers increase their yields using the soil conservation techniques she had perfected, ensuring they could actually afford the machinery they were buying. She didn't want their land. She wanted their long-term success. And her own farming operation had exploded into a leviathan. The original 400 acres of the Hayes farm was now the administrative center of a 10,000-acre agricultural empire. Clara was no longer just growing heritage white corn. She had diversified into organic soybeans, specialty oats for artisanal breweries, and a massive, vertically integrated grain drying and logistics network. The independent truckers who had saved her first harvest, led by Jim Peterson, were now the exclusive, heavily compensated freight partners for all of Hayes Ag. But the final twist of the knife in the old regime happened quietly, almost inevitably. The Osterhaus family, the massive corporate farm that had acted as Sterling's attack dogs, the ones who had sprayed her fields with dicamba under the cover of darkness, couldn't adapt to the new reality. Without Sterling feeding them foreclosed land at bargain basement prices, and unable to compete with Clara's hyper-efficient, high-margin specialty crops, they had overleveraged themselves on standard commodity corn, just as the global market tanked. When First County Bank, now under new management after Arthur Pendleton was forced into early retirement following a quiet internal audit, foreclosed on the Osterhaus acreage, it went to public auction. Clara Hayes didn't send a proxy. She attended the auction herself. She sat in the front row of the county courthouse, coolly raising her numbered paddle until every other bidder in the room was exhausted. She bought the Osterhaus land, all 3,000 acres of it, in a single, crushing cash bid. She absorbed their empire into hers, permanently erasing their legacy from the county map. On a crisp October afternoon, exactly 2 decades after her father's death, Clara drove her brand-new, custom-ordered Ford F350 into town to pick up supplies from the local hardware store. The town was thriving, fueled by the economic stability her fair business practices had fostered. As she walked out of the store, a 50-pound bag of grass seeds slung effortlessly over her shoulder, she paused. Standing by a rusted 10-year-old sedan at the edge of the parking lot was an old man. He was stooped, wearing a faded, cheap windbreaker, his face lined with deep, bitter creases. It was Richard Sterling. He was nearly 80 now, living in a small, rented duplex on the outskirts of town, sustained only by a modest social security check. He looked up, and their eyes met across the asphalt. There was no fiery confrontation. There was no gloating. Clara just looked at him, the man who had stood on her porch and called her a little girl, the man who had tried to bury her beneath the black Iowa dirt. Sterling's gaze faltered. He looked away, his shoulders slumping even further, and shuffled around to the driver's side of his beaten car, struggling to open the squeaking door. He was a ghost, haunting a town he used to own. Clara tossed the seed bag into the bed of her truck and climbed into the cab. She started the engine, the powerful diesel motor purring to life. She drove out of town, heading back toward the sprawling, pristine acreage of the Hayes farm. As she pulled up the long, familiar gravel driveway, the massive John Deere combines, painted in the signature green but bearing the proud Hayes Ag decal, were rolling out toward the fields for the fall harvest. Clara parked the truck and stepped out onto the wraparound porch of the old farmhouse. She leaned against the wooden railing, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the soil. She took a deep breath of the cold autumn air, smelling the dried corn husks and the rich, fertile earth. The earth remembers everything, they say. It remembered the greed, the sabotage, and the tears. But looking out over the 10,000 acres of her kingdom, Clara knew exactly what the earth remembered most. It remembered the woman who refused to be broken. What a journey. From a grieving 23-year-old staring down a mountain of debt to the undisputed agricultural titan of the county, Clara Hayes' story proves that the greatest weapon against arrogance is undeniable strategic competence. She didn't just beat Richard Sterling at his own game. She flipped the board, rewrote the rules, and built an empire that prioritized the community over predatory greed. The little girl didn't sell the farm. She bought the whole town. If you were inspired by Clara's incredible revenge and her brilliant business maneuvers, smash that like button, share this video with anyone who loves a true underdog story, and be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another epic tale of real-life justice. Drop a comment below. What was Clara's smartest move in taking down Sterling? We want to hear your thoughts. See you in the next story.